Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello everybody, welcome to our Wednesday Leading Change this week with Gregory Miller. Hey Greg, welcome back.
Hey Vasco, happy Wednesday.
Absolutely. Happy Wednesday, everybody. And it is only Wednesday, so there are 2 days to go. Literally, we're recording this on a Wednesday, so it kind of fits.
We are. That's right.
So, Greg, let's dive into the murky waters of change, which can be so freezing and unwelcoming at times. But we need to learn to ride those waves, as it were, because a big part of our work is to work with change. So, Greg, tell us a story about a change process you were involved with and walk us through the steps, like, over time, how that change process evolved. And as you go through those steps, highlight for us the tools, the tips, the tricks, and the techniques you learned back then that you still apply today.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think I have a good one. So this one, happened a while. Probably I was not a Scrum Master at the time. I was a BA. I mentioned on Monday's show that I started off as a BA. So I was a BA in this scenario. I was hired because they wanted someone with Scrum and Agile experience, and so for some reason they hired me. And so there was several of us BAs, and we were all given different areas of. I worked in manufacturing company at the time. So I was given the manufacturing engineering section, which I learned a lot. As you can imagine, if you're familiar with manufacturing, they're into Lean and Kaizen. So they kind of already have that mindset. So the process I'm going to explain to you wasn't really too difficult, at least from my vantage point. There were some hurdles to overcome. So I got in there, I'm a BA. On a team, they had maybe 1 or 2 Scrum teams running. It was kind of a little wonky. There was, like I said, there were maybe 4 or 5 BAs. So I don't know that we were really on a team. We kind of like worked with the team. So I would go out, work with the business, get the requirements. One thing I noticed pretty quickly, we used, our tool was Jira. I think a lot of folks use Jira as their Agile tool. So, I was writing my stories in Jira and giving them to the team to develop. So that was fine. But when the work would come in, this is the change that I was involved with. No concept of really like a backlog and prioritization. Work, if I remember right, work would come in like randomly, either through email, which I think a lot of people experience if you don't have some type of intake process. Email, or maybe someone would even call me on the phone at the time. We had desk phones, things like that. It would be all over the place. And I was like, hey, I knew enough at the time. I was like, hey, we need some type of prioritization or something going on here. So worked with my manager, and believe it or not, got all the way up to the SVP of engineering manufacturing, who actually I went and talked with this person, with my manager, and said, hey, here's my issue. I need your support, because I was told this is how you're going to get change. And even though they're familiar with they're top down, they want to hear from the leader. So I had to do that. Got support from him. What I got support for is I need some type of prioritization process and intake process, because stuff just coming all over the place and everyone needs stuff now. And what do we work on, right? It's chaos. Can't have that. And I've taken that with me to today. Obviously, the prioritization is almost numero uno, right? It has to be. You got to have it's not 1A, 1B. I've been there before. If you listen to Tuesday's show, I had a story about that too, that I could say about someone getting in trouble doing 1A, 1B type thing. So got support from him. And then the next thing, and then he, unbeknownst to me, I told him I needed some type of product owner. They had no concept of a product owner. They didn't know what that was. Nobody in that role. He helped me. He identified somebody for me. That was great. So he had my back. the next thing I did was, once I had his support, I said, okay, who are all like the big stakeholders. So I was using manufacturing. So I identified maybe half a dozen, 5 or 6 managers who are the people that are submitting the request to me, right? So somebody that reports to a manager, they want something done. They submit to that manager. That manager was then like contacting me saying, hey, Greg, this is what we need to do. But they weren't talking to each other, the 5 or 6 managers. So I got a regular meeting with all of them in a room, sat them down, displayed all the work that they had submitted, and said, we need to prioritize this. So then the next question was, how do we prioritize that? Well, luckily for me, there was a man who was in engineering at one point. He said, hey, I have a way that we used to do this in engineering. It was very simple. I would recommend keeping it very simple. You don't need 5,000 bits of criteria. It was 3 simple questions that we asked every time we bring up a story. We would ask these same 3 questions. And based on how you would answer it, it would spit out a number, right? Like 0 through 100 or whatever. And all we simply did, we went through all 3 questions. It spit out a number. And we did that for all the stories. And at the end, we had all these stories with numbers assigned to it, right? And what we simply did is we said, I say simply, but it was a little bit hard, but the hardest part in doing this is probably going to be getting everyone to agree to say, okay, John's story scored 100, mine scored a 75. I still think mine should be ahead of. That's the difficult part that people may run into, that I thought I was going to run into. It wasn't really that bad. I remember having some conversations about some stories saying, well, I think mine should be ahead. But the key here is getting all of them to leave their egos at the door and forget about what's best for my individual department and say, what's best for the company. If John's story is 100 and it's really going to help the company more than mine, then I will agree to say, okay, his will go first. And I got them to agree to that. I can see the meeting in my head right now. We had several meetings like that. The PO, who was the guy, he had another job, by the way, but he was the acting PO in addition to his day job. We got this process, after doing this for a while, down to a point where we didn't even have to meet. Well, what would happen was, instead of coming to me, these folks would go to the PO, right? Which is what should happen, right? They would go to the PO. It was still kind of crude. I had my Excel spreadsheet with all the work on it, but I had it like in buckets. I had like let's say the top 10, and then I had the like immediately 1 through 10. Then I had like the things at the bottom that could wait, just like you would in a typical, like if you're using Jira. I don't know why we didn't use Jira. I can't answer that question, but this is how it was at the
in the good old times. Excel was Jira.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, you're right. But so it got to the point where the PO would just simply call me on the phone, hey, or I would call him, and 9 times out of 10, when I got an email or something from somebody, we never really solved always the email process, but when I would get notified of something, I would go to him and he's like, yeah, I already know about it. This is where I want you to put it. We would, my top 10 is like, does this go in the top 10? Yeah, it goes here. Move this one out. A 5-minute call. So we went and that took maybe 6-7 months, not too long. I was only there a couple years. But I don't know how they are now, but I like to think that I was involved in, they never did that before, from my understanding. So the other BAs I talked to didn't really have that concept of a PO and doing like we did there. So I was kind of proud of that. And I take away from that the fact that I learned that how important a PO is, how important it is to have support from upper management. I think that's very key. I was at a place where Agile failed because we didn't have the top-down support. I think it's very obviously prioritization. It's got to be 1, 2, 3. It can't be 1A, 1B. You got to work in step with your product. You got to have the stakeholders on board. Check those egos and help them understand why it's important to have the company's best interest, aside from your little individual department. So those are my key takeaways. They stay with me to today.
And I really like the story because it's very practical, right? Like it's not a big company change. It's like just, okay, so how do we get the basic enablers in place? Like we know what to do.
Right.
It's prioritized and the stakeholders are on board. And I really like how simple you made it sound, but I bet it wasn't simple, because at the end of the day, the one phrase that you said that clearly rose some hairs on the back of my neck is that, okay, they have to check their egos at the door. And anyone that has tried that knows how hard it is.
Yes, sir.
Because at the end of the day, we work with people and through people. This part, this check the egos at the door, even though it's simple to say it, it's incredibly hard to do unless we empathize, right? If we can be right there with them, right? If we can be with Mary and Jeff and Terry and understand how they are suffering because their stories are not being prioritized. And if we can't empathize with that process, the process of checking the egos at the door, as you called it, we can't help people go through that process. So maybe one tip that I would add to that story, which I think was brilliantly told, is just, we can't ask others to check their egos at the door unless we have done it ourselves first. And I can tell you, people smell when you haven't done it.
Correct. Yeah, I would agree with that, Vasco. Yeah. If you haven't been through something or exhibit something like you're saying, people are going to know that you're fake. You have to be genuine. You can't come in and say, check your ego. Yeah, they will read through that. They're smart people. We work with smart people. They're going to notice that. So you're exactly right.
And this is one of the definitely heuristics for all of us as Scrum Masters. You have to assume that everybody in the room is at least as smart as you are.
Correct.
That was very introspective. And although the story is simple, there's so much depth in it. So thank you very much for sharing that story with us, Greg.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Leading change is one of the core skills we must acquire, but it is only one of the steps towards our success as Scrum Masters. Tomorrow, on Success Thursday, we will talk about how to define success for the Scrum Master role. We'll cover tips on how to measure your way to that position, and most importantly, how to develop that focus on continuous improvement that is as important for Scrum Masters as it is for teams. See you tomorrow. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.